The forest was deeper, darker, and more silent than any of them had imagined. Four friends, Nate, Sam, Alyssa, and Jade, had driven hours into the heart of Washington's Olympic National Park to escape their 9 to 5 routines. Camping under a harvest moon, they were after one thing: the thrill of being out in the wild, miles from civilization. But the thrill that awaited them was nothing like what they had hoped for. The first night, laughter bounced between the trees, a lively fire crackling as they swapped ghost stories. When Nate leaned in, eyes gleaming mischievously, and told them about the Pine Man, a feral figure rumored to roam these forests, Sam just scoffed. "Dude, seriously?" Sam smirked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Every forest has its boogeyman. It's just folklore." But Jade, who grew up near the area, shivered visibly. "My mom used to tell me about him," she said quietly. "Said he used to be a park ranger who went crazy, disappeared into the woods. He dragged people into the forest, never to be seen again." Her voice dropped. "But he doesn't kill them right away. They say he likes to make people scream." Nate grinned, but a glint of concern showed. "Well, all the more reason to keep our fire high and our voices louder. Right, guys?" They all laughed, nerves relieved by the flicker of the fire. But when it finally burned down and the darkness swallowed their campsite, a quiet fell over them, a silence too still, too heavy. As the group crawled into their tents, an uneasy feeling gnawed at Alyssa. Lying there, she could hear every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves. She tried to shake it off until she heard a soft but steady sound outside, like footsteps circling the tent. "Nate," she whispered, but her voice barely broke the silence. She lay frozen, her heart pounding, straining to listen. The footsteps paused. Then she heard a low, dragging breath right outside her tent. Alyssa's throat tightened. She held her breath. She wanted to scream for Nate, Sam, or Jade, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She just lay there, paralyzed by terror. And then, silence. She kept listening, and finally convinced herself it must have been an animal. In time, she drifted off to a restless sleep. The next morning, Sam was gone. His tent lay empty, his sleeping bag still unzipped. The three of them searched the surrounding woods, like calling his name, but there was nothing but endless trees and the thick mist that seemed to absorb their voices. "Maybe he went to the creek?" Nate suggested, his voice too hopeful, too forced. "Without telling us? And in the middle of the night?" Jade shot back, her tone laced with worry. They combed the area all day, their shouts fading into the eerie, indifferent silence of the forest. Night fell again, and they huddled close to the fire, eyes darting toward the tree line. Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and Jade seemed to feel it too, her gaze constantly shifting over her shoulder. Nate tried to keep them calm, telling them Sam would turn up, but even he couldn't hide the growing panic in his eyes. Late into the night, just as they were starting to drift off, a voice cut through the darkness. "Help me, please." It was Sam, or it sounded like Sam, but there was something wrong with it. His voice was raw, broken, like he was barely holding on to life. Alyssa's eyes met Jade's, and without thinking, she grabbed her flashlight and stood. "Sam?" she shouted. "Where are you?" The voice came again, closer, trembling. I'm here. Please, help." She moved towards the sound, the beam of her flashlight piercing as Nate grabbed her arm. "Alyssa, no. Something's not right." But she shook him off and Jade joined her, both of them unwilling to leave Sam out there alone. As they got deeper into the woods, the voice became more desperate. "Please, I'm hurt. It's so dark. Don't leave me here." The flashlight's beam illuminated a figure slumped against a tree. It was Sam, his face pale, his clothes torn. Relief flooded Alyssa's chest. She stepped forward, but Jade gasped and pulled her back. "Look at his eyes," Jade whispered. Sam's eyes were wide, bloodshot, empty. They darted unfocused, as if he couldn't truly see them. His mouth was twisted into a grimace, his lips moving, yet there was no more sound. A twig snapped behind them. They whipped around, shining their flashlights through the trees, but there was nothing there. When they turned back to Sam, his face had changed. A twisted, inhuman smile was spreading across his lips, his eyes fixed on them with cold, predatory hunger. "Alyssa," he whispered in a voice not his own. "You came." Terror clawed at her throat. She stumbled back, yanking Jade with her. "That's not Sam! That's not him!" They bolted through the forest, stumbling over roots and rocks, the haunting sound of their friend's voice echoing in the darkness, mocking them. The further they ran, the louder it grew, as if it was coming from every direction at once. "Nate! Nate!" Alyssa screamed as they burst back into the campsite, but Nate was gone. Only the dying embers of the fire remained, casting faint shadows that danced like specters. They searched frantically, but he was nowhere to be found. In the distance, Sam's twisted voice continued, laughing, calling their names. It seemed to be multiplying, growing louder until it felt like the whole forest was alive with that sinister sound. "Where are you?" Jade whispered, clutching Alyssa's arm in terror. Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the campsite. It looked like Nate, but his face was blank, eyes hollow. He took a step toward them, and then another, his body jerking unnaturally like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. "Let's go," Alyssa whispered, yanking Jade towards the trail. They fled through the forest, branches tearing at their skin, stumbling through the darkness. But no matter how far they ran, that hollow, broken voice followed. When dawn finally broke, they stumbled out of the trees, exhausted, bloodied, and alone. Park rangers found them on the road, barely coherent, mumbling about voices and empty eyes. A search team was sent in, but no trace of Sam or Nate was ever found. The official report concluded they had gotten lost, maybe fallen into the river or off a cliff. But Alyssa and Jade knew better. They could still hear that voice echoing in their nightmares, calling their names in a mocking, hollow tone. And they both knew, deep down, that somewhere out there in those endless woods, Sam and Nate's voices were still waiting, still calling, still screaming for help that would never come. Under the sickly glow of the waning moon, Logan, Ben, and Carla hiked through the rugged Appalachian woods, navigating toward a hidden cabin Ben had rented off a sketchy website. Ben, always the thrill seeker, insisted it was an authentic cabin. Old, isolated, and supposedly haunted by pioneers. Carla rolled her eyes but relented. Logan, who hated horror movies and had a gut feeling this was a bad idea, tagged along only because he didn't want to seem cowardly. They found the cabin just as the sky bled red with dusk. The place was strange. It seemed like it had been abandoned for decades, almost hidden by overgrown bushes and thick vines that twisted around the rotting wood. It stood at an odd angle, as if leaning away from something unseen. The door was slightly ajar. "This looks rustic," Logan muttered, trying to mask his unease with a nervous laugh. Carla pulled her jacket tighter around her. "Are you sure this is the right place, Ben?" "Definitely," Ben replied, grinning as he kicked the door fully open. Home sweet home. The smell hit them immediately, a nauseating, stale odor of mold and something else, something metallic and sour that gnawed at their nerves. Inside, the cabin was barren except for a tattered armchair, a broken-down table, and shelves sagging under the weight of dust. Dark, moldy stains spread across the walls like sinister handprints. But what truly caught their attention was a small, oddly carved wooden door embedded in the far wall, half hidden behind a faded, decaying curtain. Logan's stomach churned just looking at it. "That's creepy." "Stop being such a baby, man," Ben said, but even he couldn't hide the slight tremor in his voice. They set up their sleeping bags in the middle of the room, staying as far from the strange door as possible. As night thickened, the forest outside seemed to close in, the air dense and suffocating. They tried to laugh, tried to joke, but a weight pressed on them, an invisible presence that made each glance toward that little door feel like a stare into something they shouldn't see. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted them awake. Logan sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. The sound had come from the direction of the door. His flashlight flickered as he pointed it over, and they all froze. The door was open. Did one of you?" Carla's voice trembled, breaking the silence. Ben shook his head, eyes wide. "I didn't touch it." Logan's pulse pounded in his ears. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. Maybe it was just the wind, but the air inside was still, so thick and cold that it felt almost damp. And then they heard it, a faint dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across a floor coming from behind the door. "What is that?" Carla whispered, clutching Logan's arm. "Probably just an animal," Ben said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But he didn't sound convinced. Logan glanced at him, his face pale and taut, his bravado gone. The dragging sound continued, punctuated by a sick, wet thud every few seconds, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was right behind the door. And then silence. Logan's hand shook as he aimed the flashlight at the open door. Shadows pooled in the dark gap, murky and thick, too dark, like the light was being swallowed. He could just make out the start of a staircase descending into inky blackness. "Let's just close it and go back to sleep," Carla whispered, inching away. But Ben, his curiosity getting the better of him, shook his head. "I want to see what's down there. It's probably just an old cellar." He took a step toward the door, and Logan grabbed his arm. "Ben, no. This place is wrong. I can feel it." But Ben shrugged him off, his face set with grim determination. "Don't be such a coward. It's just a cellar." He took a step through the door, disappearing into the darkness below. The silence stretched, suffocating. Carla and Logan listened, holding their breath. Then a gasp, a soft, strangled sound came from below, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged. "Ben?" Logan called, his voice shaking. Only silence answered, and then the dragging started again, this time coming up the stairs. Logan's heart thundered, and he stumbled back, his mind racing. Carla's hand gripped his arm so tightly it hurt. We need to leave now," she whispered, her voice breaking. Just as they turned to run, Ben's figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Relief surged through them, but it quickly faded. Something was wrong. Ben's eyes were vacant, lifeless, his face pale and slack. He stood there, staring at them, his mouth hanging open as if he was struggling to speak, but no words came out. His clothes were damp, smeared with something dark. "Ben," Carla choked out. He took a shuffling step forward, his eyes still unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond them, and then his mouth moved, twisting into a grotesque smile. His voice was low, wet, like something was clogging his throat. "You should have left." Logan's stomach twisted, and he pulled Carla toward the door, but Ben's arm shot out, blocking their path. His grip was cold, unnaturally strong. "You can't leave." Ben's mouth moved, but it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "We're all down here, waiting." A hollow, echoing laugh filled the cabin, reverberating from somewhere deep below, a cacophony of voices overlapping, and then silence. Logan fought to break free, his mind screaming, but Ben's grip tightened. Carla screamed, her voice piercing the heavy air, breaking the eerie silence. In a moment of sheer desperation, Logan yanked Carla back, breaking Ben's hold, and they sprinted out of the cabin, not daring to look back. They stumbled through the dark forest, branches clawing at their skin, until they reached the main road hours later, collapsing on the side in shock. When they returned the next day with the sheriff, the cabin was empty, its door tightly shut. Inside, there was no sign of Ben, only a thick layer of dust and the strange, small door in the wall, now bolted shut. The sheriff searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but found no trace of Ben. To this day, Logan can still hear the faint sound of that dragging noise whenever he closes his eyes, and he knows in his bones that somewhere in this darkness beneath the cabin, Ben is still there, waiting for him. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. Angela, Rob, and Maya had driven out to a remote lake nestled deep within the Rockies, hoping to escape the noise of the city. The lake was said to be pristine, barely touched by campers or hikers, a hidden gem. The few online reviews mentioned only a single caution: don't camp by the lake, camp on the ridge. But Angela had dismissed it. A lakeside view was what they wanted, and they found the perfect spot right by the water's edge. The first day was beautiful. Clear skies, fresh mountain air, and the water was so still it reflected their faces like a mirror. They set up camp, swam, laughed, and watched the sun dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the lake. It was as if they'd found their own little world. But when night fell, an oppressive silence settled over the lake, too deep, too complete. Not a single bird or insect broke it, and the sky was so dark it felt like it might swallow them whole. They sat around the fire, their voices dropping into whispers, barely daring to break the silence. Then, just as they were about to crawl into their tents, Rob noticed something. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his finger pointing toward the lake. Angela and Maya looked where he was pointing. Across the lake, near the opposite shore, was a figure. A person standing motionless, half shrouded in darkness. Even in the dim light, they could tell the figure was staring directly at them. It was a man, tall and thin, his body unnaturally still. Maya shivered. "Maybe it's another camper? Then why is he just standing there, staring at us?" Angela whispered, her voice tense. "And did anyone hear him walk up?" The figure didn't move. didn't seem to breathe, and the longer they stared, the more wrong it felt. They turned away for just a moment, discussing what to do, but when they looked back, the figure was gone. The shoreline was empty, the lake still as glass. Maybe we should camp on the ridge, like they suggested, Maya said uneasily, trying to mask her fear with a nervous laugh. But Rob shook his head, brushing it off as a trick of the light. If he comes over, we'll just deal with it then. No big deal. They retreated into their tents, each lying awake, listening, straining to hear any sound of footsteps. But there was nothing but that heavy, pressing silence. Around midnight, a sound broke through, a faint splashing, as if someone were walking through the water. Angela sat up, heart pounding, listening. She crawled to the tent's opening and peered out, gasping softly. The figure was back, this time standing closer, just a few feet into the water, still staring at their tents, silent and motionless. "Rob, Maya," she whispered, waking them. They crawled to her side, eyes widening as they saw the figure. "He's closer," Rob said, his voice cracking. As they watched, the figure took a step toward them, the water rippling around him, slow, deliberate. With each step, he seemed to come closer without moving fast at all, his face a blur of darkness under the shadow of his hat and his arms hanging stiffly at his sides. Let's just get out of here," Maya stammered, frantically beginning to pack up, her hands trembling. Rob and Angela nodded, their eyes never leaving the man as they hurriedly gathered their things. But as they struggled to pack, the figure disappeared. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, as if he'd never been. They paused, waiting, their breaths caught in their throats. The silence was heavier than ever. "Maybe he left?" Rob whispered hopefully, his voice hollow. Then they heard it, a dragging sound, something wet, heavy, moving up from the shoreline and toward them, though they couldn't see anything. It was as if something invisible was walking right up to their tents, feet shuffling, wet with lake water, circling them. A cold dread seized Angela. "We need to run. Now." Without waiting, they grabbed what they could and bolted into the trees, stumbling up the rocky path toward the ridge. As they ran, the dragging sound followed, getting closer with each step, though they couldn't see behind them. And then, a voice. "Why? Are you running?" The voice was slow, hollow, as if the words had been dragged up from the bottom of a well. They didn't turn around, they just ran faster, breath catching, feet slipping over rocks and roots. When they reached the ridge, the sound stopped. Panting, they looked down toward the lake, trying to spot their pursuer, but the shoreline was empty, the lake a mirror once more. There was no sign of the man, no hint of anything out of the ordinary. But then Maya noticed something strange. Near the edge of the lake where they had camped, 3 shapes lay in the sand, 3 sleeping bags spread out undisturbed. That doesn't make any sense," Maya whispered, her voice cracking. "We took our bags with us." And that was when they saw themselves, lying in those sleeping bags on the shore, their faces pale and empty, eyes open and staring into the night sky. It was them, but lifeless, as if they'd never woken up. The sight drove an icy spike through their hearts. What is this?" Rob gasped, stepping back, horrified. As they stared, the sleeping bags on the shore started to drag themselves toward the water, inch by inch, as if something unseen was pulling them into the lake. No, this isn't real," Angela whispered, clutching her head. But the dragging continued, silent and inevitable, until the sleeping bags disappeared beneath the water, leaving only the still surface of the lake. And then, from the depths, 3 pale faces floated up, like staring at them, mouths open in silent screams. They fled back down the trail, all the way to the car, not daring to look back. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, breathless and shaken, where they tried to explain what they'd seen. But no one believed them. That night, each of them had the same dream. They were lying by the lake, staring up at the night sky, unable to move, unable to scream, as cold water lapped over their faces, dragging them slowly, inch by inch, down into the dark depths. And when they woke up, they could still feel that cold, suffocating water around their throats. They never returned to that lake, but every so often, Angela swears she hears that dragging sound in her dreams, getting closer each time.